Welcome to my wonderful talk at this very early hour. I'm glad that some people who are not forced to be here came. So, here are a bunch of famous people who were homeschooled. Only one of them is male, because every list I looked at had mainly females who were homeschooled in it. So we're going to start with a fun activity. On your copy of the PowerPoint slides, just write down whether each of these statements are true or false. Do you guys have your so fancy using this little button over here. Today the talk is about homeschooling in Iowa. We'll talk about how and why people homeschool in Iowa as well as across the United States. And how many of you are teachers or going to be teachers? Awesome. Half of my audience is the audience I thought I was going to have. So this will have a little more teacher slant to it, possibly a little bit of school administrator. Just because that's where the legislation lies a little bit more. And the way that the talk is going to go is I will tell you who's going to homeschool, and then we'll go from there into legislative stuff and then a recent study. So who homeschools is about 1.5 million students in grades 5 through 6, ages 5 through 17, so in the regular K through 12, which is about 2.9% of the student population. And that was at the time of the survey, which was in 2003. And that was done by, it was a national survey, so part of the National Children Education Survey, I believe is what it's called. Some government agency calls parents in their homes, and then they answer questions about whether their child goes to school, where they go to school, et cetera, et cetera. And this is the excitement, this is my relating it to what's going on right now, is that there are 2 gold medalists who were homeschooled in the Olympics, and one who did not medal but enjoys freestyle skiing. So there are homeschoolers everywhere. So why do people homeschool? This is what I started doing research was because I wanted to know why people were homeschooling, because I had a feeling it wasn't just the people that are stereotyped as homeschoolers as the religious people, but I figured there had to be another population out there since I was briefly homeschooled, and some of my friends were homeschooled, and they weren't conservative religious people. So all the studies have found about 5 things that will be a reason that parents will give for why they're choosing to homeschool. So the educational philosophy, and that's, I want my child to experience education in a full way, or I want them in a less traditional classroom, or I don't, those kinds of things. Religion and ethics being, I want them to learn about Jesus, and so I'm going to use this curriculum that talks about Jesus. Or I want them to learn how to live in what I consider a moral way, so we're going to do whatever so that they grow up with the morals that I have and I want them to have. School climate being bullying is bad in schools, or the quality of teaching they don't really like, or it's not safe to go to school, those kinds of things. Special needs of child, those can be health concerns or children that have autism or learning disabilities that parents don't feel are getting met by the school. And then family lifestyle and parenting philosophy, and that would be, I always planned on homeschooling my children, now I have children, therefore I'm homeschooling them. And that can be their primary reason for doing it. And so these main things were pulled out from that national survey I talked about in the beginning, as well as through a bunch of different little studies. So now we're going to talk about homeschooling options in Iowa. There's competent private instruction, which includes homeschool assistance programs, which is a big thing for teachers because that's one way that teachers can get involved with homeschoolers. Independent private instruction, which is new starting this fall. The legislation was passed for that. Private instruction, which has recently been modified, and dual enrollment. And if at any point you have questions, feel free to interrupt. That includes you over here with all your questions. So competent private instruction is where school-age children have a supervising teacher. So mom will teach them at home during the day, and then the supervisor will meet with mom or talk to mom I think it's about once per month over the phone. Or dad's homeschooling, and they have a teacher come in and teach a certain subject and supervise. So they have to file paperwork and with the local district and state, and so then a practitioner, which would be a certified teacher. So say, for any of you that are becoming certified teachers, you decide you want to be a stay-at-home mom while your kids are little. Here's a way to earn some extra cash, is to come in and be that certified teacher who looks over their curriculum or checks in with them or sees what kinds of services they need or help with and those kinds of things. And these can also include homeschool assistance programs, or it can be used in conjunction with dual enrollment, which we'll both talk about those in more detail later. And then there's also this new, the reason this is now attractive even more, is the parent-taught driver's education option if you do this. And so, as far as I understand it, in Iowa you have to have a driver's ed class before you can get your license. Is that correct? Right, so that's not how it is in Pennsylvania. So whenever there was this big blow up about this legislation, I was like, I don't get it, because you just have your parents teach you. But now parents who homeschool their children, if they do certain ways of homeschooling, such as this competent private instruction, is they can do the driver's ed for their kids, so they don't have to take a class elsewhere. And of this is that they have to have school for 148 days during the year, which is 37 per quarter. And often when you talk to homeschoolers, they say, we always go above and beyond that because every day is a learning experience. Or just because of the way they structure their curriculum. If they go skiing, that's all of their gym smashed into one day. So it's easy. Most of them feel that this is 365 when they homeschool, from all the parents I've talked to. So homeschool assistance programs are unique to Iowa. Some other states have a cooperative between homeschooling and the public school, but this is one that is specifically unique to Iowa. It will hopefully be what I do my dissertation on. And the way it works is that these organizations are funded by school districts, and they help serve these homeschooling students in a way that's meaningful to the students in the population. So they can include having teachers that teach workshops or classes to students and or parents. They can pay for these teachers and any staff that are needed. They also provide curriculum or computer software or the computers themselves or printers or laminators or whatever families think they need and the HSAP can afford. And then once those parents stop homeschooling, all of the materials that they used go back to the HSAP. At the very least, they will provide that practitioner, the certified teacher who oversees things. So where we are, we have the Iowa City HSAP, the Marion, and the Mid-Prairie. Those are the three that are kind of our area. And so because of the way that HSAPs are set up, there's great difference. So the Iowa City one does more like workshop classes, like this is targeting a 3rd to 4th grader, and it's going to be science, and we're going to learn about trees. And so then the parents come in with their kid and observe the lessons so that they can follow up on it or do whatever they want at home. But there's a certified teacher who gives the lesson itself. The way that Mid-Prairie or Marion works is they do more like classes, like you would see in a typical school. Their kids come in for trig 3 days a week, and they do it for an hour or whatever. And then they have prom, and they have graduation, and they have, I don't know what else schools have that is like dances, those kinds of things. And just like students can choose to open enroll in public schools, you can also do the same for HSAP. So there, as long as you get your paperwork in by the deadline. So if you're in Iowa City and you're like, hey, I like the Marion HSAP, it has these awesome, it has this graduation and this prom, and I get a diploma, and it's amazing in that way, then you can go to Marion's program. Does that make sense? And so again, this is something that you, as a licensed teacher, could do if you were interested in having some work, but not necessarily working for a school district full-time. And this is this new and exciting independent private instruction. So this is another one of those alternative options where the reason that trying to think of it, the stuff that I read that's put out by homeschooling groups talk about this because it fits well with the changing family structure. So grandparents who are homeschooling, or aunts who are homeschooling, or single moms who they take, they have rotating days off, so they have 4 students and they just rotate who's teaching or whatever. So it can have up to 4 unrelated students. There's no tuition, but the instructor does get paid. It's just not tuition for the program. And then they provide private or religious-based instruction, and they have certain topics that they have to cover. And then they do submit paperwork, but only if it's requested by the by the school district. So some homeschooling organizations have a dislike of turning in paperwork to school districts and state agencies. And so a lot of the stuff that you'll read will say, if it's put out by a homeschooling organization, will say, this one's awesome, you don't submit paperwork to whomever. And that was a big win this year, if you read about it, and that they talked about in Iowa, and this is all Iowa specific, there are many ways to not have to submit that paperwork. And the paperwork previously was something that said, I am so-and-so's mom, so-and-so is being homeschooled, they are 6 years old, and that was the end of the paperwork. Or we're going to do this kind of instruction. And so there are several organizations that are excited that they don't have to submit the paperwork to the government because they feel that the government should have no input in how they educate their child or traction. And then there's the private instruction by a non-licensed person, in which they file paperwork, and then the parents get to instruct doing whatever they want, and then the child gets evaluated annually using a nationally recognized test such as the Iowa test, or that's the one that most people in Iowa use if they're going to use a standardized test. Or they do a portfolio where they have to include curriculum and work samples and copies of any evaluations that were done, like if the student took a test that the parent created, like you have unit tests or those kinds of things. Or they can do a private evaluation, which is they come and they meet with a teacher who can administer an assessment of any kind, or a school psychologist, I guess, that it will look at achievement in terms of a standardized, more individualized test. And so this was what most homeschoolers did prior to this new legislation thing, was just this private instruction with an evaluation component at the end. So then there's this new private instruction where they don't have to file that paperwork. So, again, this was viewed as a big win by homeschooling organizations. And then there's the dual enrollment, which I have talked to a few homeschooling families who have done it, some successfully and some not so successfully, depending on their school district. And the benefit of dual enrollment is, especially when you get to upper grades, is that you can take your child in for classes. So say you're really comfortable and you're really strong in geography and history and science, but you're really not good at calculus, and your child really wants to take calculus, so they can go in for that 1 hour of class and take the calculus, whereas you cover the rest of the curriculum at home. And it also lets them participate in extracurricular activities. just like any public school students, without paying additional fees unless there are enrollment fees with the school. And so that's great for those who want to do marching band or football or, I don't know, whatever extracurriculars the school offers. And I know so my students read an article and then wrote discussion questions, and I know that one of my students wrote a question about this, so I'm going to talk about it because it kind of fits in here. They were asking about how homeschoolers socialize, which I think is a big mystery to most people, because we think about homeschooling and we think, oh, they go home and they spend their days at home and they get taught at home, and then after they do their school part of the day, then they hang out at home and they make dinner and they do whatever they're going to do with their family, because that's what students do. Is they go to school, they do whatever they're going to do, and then they come home. But the way that homeschooling does tend to work is a little bit more outside of the house. So there's the homeschool assistance programs, or the dual enrollment, or cooperatives, which I didn't talk about much, which is a whole bunch of homeschooling families that get together and just either do curriculum things together, or they go on field trips together, and their kids socialize. So instead of having, one of the benefits of homeschooling is that instead of having divisions by grade, is that the students are constantly navigating the various levels. So they'll be talking to their little sibling who's in kindergarten or preschool, and turn around and they're talking to an adult about whatever they want to. So they develop an ability to cross those age gaps more fluidly. But then they'll do 4-H, or they'll go to the library, or they can do rec club sports if they don't want to be involved with school. So they do get out. Let's rephrase that. They can get out if they choose to. But like any group of people, there are always going to be the ones who are a little more awkward. If you go to a high school, not everyone's going to have awesome social skills. Or if you come to college, not everyone has the same level of social skills. So the same thing is going to carry over to homeschoolers, where some of them are not so socially gifted, whereas others are going to be much more socially gifted. Sorry for my little tangent there. And so now we're going to talk about curriculum. And it might not be too surprising. So curriculum varies. You can get the prepackaged curriculums, which is very similar to that which is offered by a school district, where you have, this is your math book, and here's your math notebook that goes with it. Or you can get an internet-based curriculum. And then there's this mixed curriculum, which is kind of the more you pick and choose what you want. So you take this chapter math from this book, and then you're going to read this book for literature, and then you're going to choose, whatever fits your fancy, whatever you think meets your child's needs. So it's kind of that more eclectic version of curriculum.
I have a question.
Yes.
One of them was about the Common Core. Do you know if this is influencing the decisions of the parents?
So luckily, this was a total coincidence. Yesterday a friend said, you should check out this blog about homeschooling, right? And so I pulled it up on my computer in the middle of class, and then continued on with what I was doing. And last night I accidentally clicked on that tab right after I read that question, and the blog post was all about Common Core curriculum. So it turns out that some of the curricula are changing to have more of that Common Core piece included in them. And one of the concerns of homeschoolers is that the Common Core is not a good thing. And so the blog post itself was about whether homeschooling curriculum with the Common Core included was a bad thing, or if it was a good thing, or it depends on the curriculum type of thing. So they are starting to incorporate it, but homeschoolers as a whole seem to be a more leery population, and a little bit more guarded, I would say, than those who send their children to public school.
So do you think more will homeschool then?
So they're working, I think it's a new thing, and so they're sussing out whether it's a good thing, but some of the curricula do have it. And those that don't explicitly mention having the components which align with the Common Core do sometimes have the pieces that But that is a new thing that they're starting to talk about, which was exciting. Because I hadn't, until I read that question, I hadn't really thought about homeschooling and Common Core as one unit. I always thought of them separately, just because my brain is homeschooling or it's like right wider world. So, did I answer your question, or whoever's question? All right. And then there's the teaching style. So, can someone tell me how they think a homeschooler's day goes? Anyone? There's no wrong answer. Yes.
I think it's longer. Like, you know, at schools it's like 6 hours. They probably take a lot of breaks frequently, and the day's a lot longer. And I don't know, what I picture is they don't just stay in home all day. They use a lot of their resources, whether it's like their, I don't know, the prairie outside, or like for science experiments, or like physically going to places because they have the flexibility. But it's like, could be over a longer period, like you were saying, like the 148 days.
Anybody else?
Lots of praying.
Lots of praying. Start with the prayer, end with the prayer, and pray in the middle?
Yeah.
I always picture them just like in front of a computer. That way.
The wonderful thing is all of you are correct. I know, isn't that dissatisfying there? So the structure of the day does differ, and it does depend on the family and what they're into and what they think. And these are listed from the most structured at top to the least structured at the bottom. And so there's the classical homeschooling, which when I read about it in literature is very, you know, they're focused on rote memory. They want to learn Greek and Latin and all the and like rhetoric, and it's very this kind of regimented, what you would imagine as like how they used to do school back in the day, like back when your parents, or not your parents, when your grandparents or your great-grandparents were in school, is what I read about for classical homeschooling. And then I went to a homeschool convention, and that was totally not what they thought classical homeschooling was. They had prepackaged curricula that went with it, and it was just that you would read more of the Greek mythology, and you would read older things, but it wasn't rote by any means. So I haven't decided what classical homeschooling means to me, just because it seems so, based on what the researchers say it's supposed to be and how parents address it, is so very different. But it does have that kind of the old roots piece to it. Schooling at home is what it sounds like. You get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you do what you do, then you sit down with your books just like you would in school, and you go through things. You have a break at lunch, you might have recess. Some families will go as far as the children will walk out the front door, walk around the house, and come back in, and then they'll be at school and they'll like say the pledge. They may say a prayer, depending on why they choose to homeschool. And then, so that's how it works. Then there's the kind of lifestyle of learning, which is more of, this is how we learn, and we kind of weave it in with what we're doing. So we're going to do math unit on fractions. We're going to make a cake, because that helps you learn how fractions work together. Or the unit study, which I think sounds like fun, where you try and get everything to fit together. So say you have a child who loves the Civil War and like totally wants to learn about the Civil War. So your geography, you're going to make it about the Civil War. Your history, of course, is going to be the Civil War. The science would be, maybe you're looking at things that they were discovering at the time of the Civil War, or producing and how they would produce them. Your math unit would be, somehow you would weave it in terms of, I don't know, so-and-so, like this troop left this point at this time, this troop left, where are they going to meet in the middle? Instead of having those train problems that everyone hates in math. And then in your language arts, you would be reading about the Civil War. So it kind of all faces whatever your child is interested in. The eclectic reminds me of that mixed curriculum. We're just going to grab whatever works. Hopefully there's a little bit of thought that's going into it, but you're trying to choose what's best. The worldview is choosing things that help develop your child into the human you would like them to become. And so I have a difficult time articulating this one. So I will look at my notes finally. Maybe. Makes you feel good. We made a lot of progress since I last looked at these. Acknowledges the education is driven by beliefs and values. And then my notes cut off. So it is, instead of, I think of worldview in kind of a combination of the lifestyle of learning, so that they do those pieces, that they weave it in with whatever they're doing, but they also put the morals into it, and maybe a little bit more prayer into it if that's what they're interested in, or maybe it's more of a they think that volunteering is important, so they'll weave a lot of that into their regular day. And then there's unschooling, which is the more relaxed approach where my child is going to figure out what they want to learn, and they'll come to me and tell me what they want to do, but I'm just going to hang out. And whenever they have an interest, I will provide all the sources that I need, but it's very child-driven, child-led, which any of these can go bad, but I think there's a higher chance of this going bad just because there isn't that necessarily that parent push. Yes?
Did you find that the parents' education influenced their teaching style?
So I did not look at that.
Okay.
But I can tell you a little bit about parents' education. So there's two schools of thought, and there used to be just one until I found this amazing article that totally disagreed with everything I had read thus far, which is often how the research process goes. So a lot of them say that parents' education level won't influence whether or not they choose to homeschool or how they homeschool or anything like that. The most recent article I read that did a whole bunch of, and most homeschooling research is qualitative in nature and focuses on a small population. The most recent one I did a lot of quantitative stuff, kind of gathered all the articles, which is a meta-analysis, and analyzed them, and then came up with these really elaborate statistical equations that at the end said that parents who have a high, through college education or more, there's a greater probability of homeschooling kids K through 6, but then once they hit 6 and beyond, it's an equal amount of parents who are college graduates, graduate college graduates, or high school dropouts who are choosing to homeschool. And the hypothesized reason why there's this disparity between K through 6 and then 6 and beyond is because after that the material starts getting harder. And so even if you have gone and you do have your college degree, not necessarily are you going to be good at teaching your child mathematics. So you really have no benefit over the other parents anymore, and so that's why it kind of evens out. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So a recent study, and I'll kind of go a little more quickly through this. This was my study that I did, and I wanted to look at why parents choose to homeschool and how it relates to curriculum and pedagogy. And I had them do a survey, and then I also had them, in that survey, they reflected on what they did. So I ended up with 1,158 participants, which was way more than I thought I would get. And 95.6% of them were parents. And I had someone from each state, and they were mostly white, but there was a little bit of diversity, which is what is typical to find, is that a lot of more white parents will homeschool than other minorities, though the African American homeschooling population is on the rise. And so what I found through this whole study was that for those who chose to homeschool for their educational philosophy was that the methods they chose differed greatly from the school. So they weren't so necessarily going to do that school at home. They were more into that eclectic mixed type of thing. And they wouldn't follow structured curriculum. They would just grab and pull where they wanted to. And if you think about that, that would make sense because of that. I mean, that's why they're homeschooling, is not because they want to produce school at home, but because they wanted to get away from the way school was structured. Family lifestyle and parenting philosophy. So they were very focused on shaping their children's beliefs, values, and lifestyles, and they enjoyed that control of curriculum and the content they taught. Religion and ethics would often choose curriculum that allowed for transmission of values and beliefs, and they would use those prepackaged curricula, which works because there are a plethora of homeschooling, religious-based curricula available. And I checked them out, and they're just like, they're just like regular curricula you would get at school. It's just a little bit more biblically based. And then parents would often use the structure of a school day. So they would be those ones that would send their kids out around the house, come in, say the pledge, say a prayer, and get going with their day. The ones who were homeschooling for the special needs of the child would choose a curriculum that allowed for the children's needs. And then they would also do what allows they would start more like the school-based curriculum, and they'd slowly become more eclectic as they became more confident. But they could meet their child's needs in their own way. And then the school climate was that they would use the materials that they had at school, so that would still be, but they, like the prepackaged curricula, or borrow the school's curriculum. And the reason that they were doing it is for those environmental aspects, but the content was okay. So then I also looked at, because there was such a difference whenever they said, when they took the time of the survey, and then when they reflected back on what they had initially done when they started homeschooling. And a lot of them, their reasons for homeschooling had changed. And so maybe they were religious, or it was the special needs of child, or whatever. And it would change over time, and it became more of an educational philosophy bend. And that was because hypothesizes that they realized that the importance of their child's education. And they then when they realized how important it was to them, they wanted to control it a little bit more. The people, pedagogy changed, and that was that they often start out in more structured and then would kind of go to less structured, which is more that worldview, lifestyle of learning area. And that was because now they feel more comfortable. And then there's the curriculum, and often they would start more cookie cutter, and then as they became more confident, so second or third year, they'd start doing a little bit more mixed. And so the one thing it does show, which is concurrent with, or in agreement with every other piece of research I read and every homeschooling conference I've attended and anything that has come up, is that parents change the way they homeschool and get more interest as they go because they get more comfortable, and their students get more comfortable, or their children, and their children will say, hey, I want to learn about this, and the mom's not like, I can't do that anymore. They kind of feel more comfortable, like, I'm going to go after it, and if it totally flops, it's okay. There's always tomorrow. Okay, so now look, theoretically, at your paper. If you had written down at the beginning what is true and false, do you still agree with the answers you wrote down at the beginning of the lecture? This is my pre-post assessment based on information I didn't really talk about in the lecture. So the answer is that all of these, according to the article from which I grabbed them, are false. The article was on common homeschooling myths revisited. So again, the social piece I think I talked about earlier, but then talking about differing ages. The homeschooling fails to prepare good citizens. There are several studies that say that homeschoolers spend more time volunteering and going to like public meetings and advocating for things than the average than the non-homeschooled citizen. Yes.
Wouldn't that be because they have more flexibility in their schedule?
So this is like when they grow up. Like so whenever they're, I was going to say in our age group, and then I realized that's kind of a big gap. But whenever they're kind of in the college to the, like, I would say the college age to that 25-ish age range when most students kind of stop being involved in the outside world, I would say. You know, they're still going to be the ones that go and vote and advocate and stuff more than non-homeschool students. That answer your question? Yes.
As far as socialization, have there been surveys or studies done asking the homeschooled students their level of happiness with their socialization or their amount of friends that they have?
That is a fantastic question. And I'm sure I could look up the answer. So I do not know the answer to that question. I haven't read any that seemed like that was the primary focus of the article, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was thrown in, because there are some about the socialization when they get to the college or their first year of college, but I have not read into it in depth. Sorry.
I just wonder about the social misfits, because I feel like all of these like stereotypes come from something, you know? And I think back to my school when I know the homeschoolers, because in gym class, someone came to gym. They stood by themselves and they didn't participate. I remember feeling bad for them, thinking like, they don't have friends, but how could they have friends here when we're all together all day long and they come in for 45 minutes? And clearly they could have had other groups, but I wonder about the parents who aren't taking them to those other groups. Like one of my neighbors has, I think, 6 kids that she homeschools, and they're Islamic, and I have never seen them leave the house. And so, granted, with 6 kids, I don't know if that would take 2 vehicles to take them somewhere. But I wonder, like, where are they going and who are they interacting with besides each other, you know?
Yeah. And I'm not going to say that those situations don't exist, because I have run into them. So in Iowa, the most well-known, I would say, organization of homeschoolers is the Network of Iowa Christian Home Educators. If you want a cultural experience, you can go to their work there. I went to their conference. It was very different than any other conference I've attended before. Usually I go to professional conferences. This one's made of families and their kids come, and it was very interesting to go to a conference where there were children. And there were definitely those who lacked what I would consider social skills. And there were then those who were mind-blowingly social and who were like I was like, oh, it's like I'm talking to someone who is older than me right now. You know what I mean? Someone who has, because they have, their parents have owned businesses, and so, they do their schoolwork in a little bit in the morning, and then that's something that's typical, I forgot to say back a few slides, is that they'll get their schoolwork done in a shorter amount of time. So like they'll do most of their schoolwork in the morning and then do whatever they want in the afternoon. So if like their parents own a business, they'll either be doing their math with that business, or they'll be, doing their schoolwork in the morning, and then when they're selling, there was one in one of the Iowa newspapers that talked about her parents owned a chocolate shop and how she was, doing whatever she did there, like the bookkeeping there, and ran this store with parent supervision there. So then there are those people who have these social skills and these life skills that I would say outpace the typical student. So there is definitely that range. And I think that's why the homeschooling, I think that's why this myth continues to carry on, is because there are those ones that confirm stereotypes that are super secluded, pray all day, have unbalanced skill development, maybe minimal social skills if you fall outside of their comfort zone type of thing. And I have heard about different homeschoolers who have gone to public schools, and from people in the school itself, not from the homeschooling family, and they said how unfortunate it seems for the students who get brought back. But then you also have to think about, why are parents bringing their kids back? Like, is it because they've realized the child's not making progress and they need to? And so in that case, it does make sense that the ones that are thrown back in sometimes do have those lacking social skills. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, and I think it
By
just
not
makes
having
sense.
information.
Yeah, it makes sense that I remember the ones that stuck out. So I've probably been exposed to people who have homeschooled that were socially on pace. I probably just didn't know they were homeschooled. So I think that just makes sense that that's what I remember.
But yes, everyone that I've talked to has had that family. They're like, I don't know if that was a good decision. And then most people homeschool only for religious reasons. And that is is only, based on the data from the 2003 NCES, is that 31% homeschooled because of their concerns about home environment. 30% did it for religious and moral, and the rest did it for various reasons, like children's physical and mental health, their special needs in terms of learning, other reasons which I wasn't sure what that meant, or what was left after that, or dissatisfaction with the academics. So based on a national survey, which is the best guess we have, is that about 30% do it for religious reasons, which leaves another 70% of doing it for non-religious reasons. That said, you should always interpret most things about homeschooling, especially if there are numbers. Any study needs to be interpreted with a grain of salt, just because of the way homeschoolers react. So it's not necessary that you're always going to get the most balanced phone call. You know, if you have the ones who are more secluded, I'm calling from the government to ask you some questions. That's not necessarily going to be someone who's going to stay on the phone. So just interpret those things with a grain of salt as well. Yes?
You just mentioned government. I was kind of surprised when you talked about the Homeschool Assistance Program, HSAP, I think.
HSAPs, yeah.
HSAP, and that it's funded by school districts.
Mm-hmm.
I sort of have a little bit of a concern that my tax dollars are going to a group of people who are voluntarily stepping back from society and the community. It's like potentially the best, brightest parents who could make a school district better. The concerns that they have with the school district, they're actually backing away and giving up on it instead of working hard, and then we're funding them to do that. Something just doesn't sit right with me there.
I had a feeling you would have a problem with that. So I could see the concern because the parents that would potentially be the most involved parents are now your least involved parents, correct? And the students that could have potentially been the best and brightest that would be like, look at our school, it has awesome mathematics, are now, look at our homeschooling, it has awesome mathematics over here. And I think the reason that HSAPs do exist in Iowa, besides campaigning from lobbying from homeschooling organizations, and from what I hear, based on the homeschooling group literature, it seems like they do a lot of advocating in Iowa, and they're fairly successful. Is that because they're paying, homeschooling families pay taxes, and so it's only right that they get a portion of it back through, and it's not, whenever, I forgot to say this, so homeschool assistance programs, even though they do buy curricula, they do have to follow similar guidelines as the school district, so they're not allowed to buy religious curricula. It has to be, and I forgot to say that part. However, there are rumors that sometimes HSAPs do that, and they keep it, like in the HSAP instructor's trunk, as opposed to on, wherever the building is stored. Like, oh, you want that curriculum? Hush, hush. Like, here you go, let me slide it to you. But supposedly, it doesn't exist. So it's supposed to be a more mainstream, I guess, curricula. So whether the same materials as the school uses or similar materials, if that makes you feel any better about where your tax dollars are going. But I think it's just an advocacy thing. And I think it's great for those people who want to homeschool because of the flexibility. But I don't know. But yes, it is a concern. And there have been papers written on that as well. I could share some with you. No, I'm here for moral support only. Any other questions? And I know that some of you have to go to class, I think. So if any point anybody has to go because they're going to be late for class, feel free to go. Yes?
I'm just going to ask real quick, would you talk about why you were homeschooled or what your experience was like?
So I was homeschooled because I wanted to be homeschooled and I was bored out of my gourd at school. And it was great and it was fantastic. And I learned about the Civil War and did awesome timelines. And my mom was she's not quite mainstream. And so I liked and I lived in a more rural, more conservative community. And my family was not quite that format. liked it because I got to do more experiences, and instead of, you know, my music class being, because my mom did keep it, she had a feeling I would end up going back to school, because she's my mother and she's very in tune with all of her children. So she kept me on the school curriculum while I was home. And so we would have like music class day, or music class morning, and we listened to music from a whole bunch of different cultures instead of spending music class learning to sing whatever it was for choir. Or my piano lessons were part of my music class. And we would do gym class because on Tuesdays we'd go skiing, you know, like those kinds of fun things. And then I went back, and if I could go back to my 5th grade self and hit her over the head, I would. I went back because I wanted to be in the talent show. And if I was homeschooled, I was not allowed to be in the talent show. And okay, like at this point, you know, you're thinking that was really stupid reasoning. But when I was that age, I was like so bummed about it. So I did end up going, and the reason they said, because my mom went back and forth with them a couple of times, and this was in Pennsylvania, not Iowa, and they said it was an insurance liability to have someone who's not attending the school be in the talent show in case, you know, I don't know what happened. I lost my place and fell off the stage, or, I mean, nothing did happen. I went back, and I did go back to school, and for the next month or so, I sat there and did nothing because I had already completed all of the exercises that we were doing at home. And so people, like I remember I would sit there and they'd be like, hey, get into groups and do these math problems. And I would have some kid in my group who'd be like, no, you're wrong here. So I'm like, no, you're wrong. See, my paper has the answers and it has a star and it says I'm corrected. And so for that, I think that brief experience reminded me, and I would only do stuff from like the morning part because I was an early riser anyway. And I remember just going back and being like, I did school for 4 hours a day, and I still outpaced my peers. And that was just, like, after that, I was like, I see why people homeschool. Because whenever you have one-on-one, if you have one child you're homeschooling, or 1-on-4, or 1-on-6, you do get through a lot more than if you have 1-on-25 or 30. Where you're slowing down for the kids who are behind and trying to speed up for the ones who are at the top, whereas here, you know, you're working with your kids. Sometimes the older ones can help the younger ones, or the younger ones can help the older ones. Or in my case, my mom could just help me at that moment, and I could continue on with what I was doing. I was fortunate because my mom and dad both worked from home, and so I could easily just go in and like wait for her to finish her phone call and be like, hey, here's my problem, help now. So, but yes, that was, and now you're probably wondering, if I had children, would I homeschool them? And I still haven't made a decision. It's a good thing I don't have children. Because I think homeschooling is awesome, but I also think it takes a special kind of parent to be able to do that. I'm not sure I'm that special kind of parent. So, any more questions?
Just real quick,
Yes.
I've worked in college admissions
Yes.
For several years, and we always dreaded the homeschool applicant for 2 reasons. One was, if we think grade inflation is bad in a public school setting, think of how objectively parents can grade their kids. So really, you know, grades really meant nothing to us, because of course all homeschool kids get A's, woo! So we're concerned about, and so, to a certain extent, the standardized test, the ACT, could balance that out a little bit. But then the other concern was, once they were there,
How were they
their ability to socialize, and we sort of had these ideas that parents were concerned about protecting their students from the world, but then suddenly at 18 they were ready to take on the world.
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't it have been better for them to ease into the trials and tribulations of the world as a 3rd grader or 4th grader? And suddenly, like, some of them go crazy when they get to college, and others just can't handle it. So I don't know.
So there have been studies on that, and supposedly college admissions for especially have gotten more accepting and understanding over time. And certain colleges now have like the special, if you're a homeschooler and you're applying, this is the kind of application you do, because the grades don't necessarily mean as much. So And I noticed that when I was sitting at the keynote speaker at the homeschooling conference, one was like, well, is he trying his best? Is he, you know, because the mom's like, I don't want to give him all A's, and he's not doing so well, so like, what do I give him? And then, you know, like, it's like the dad's relaying the conversation to the huge audience. He's like, well, is he trying his best? Is he making progress? Then he's getting an A, and I'm like, And so I can see how the grade thing would be a concern. But supposedly there's more acceptance, and they're coming up with different ways. It's also not my area of interest in homeschooling, so I haven't followed up on it that much. There are also homeschoolers that are doing taking classes at community college, like regular high school students who will take some classes at the community college and some at their high school. So there'll be homeschoolers that'll do those community college things. And so not all of them are the shut-ins, but you'll definitely notice the shut-ins are going to be the ones that are going to have the problems, because the good ones, like the ones who have been socialized, are just going to take off and go, if that makes sense. And there's also it was interesting at the conference that, you know, there are booths, and there were tons of booths for colleges that would align more with the population, where it's a more very conservative campus, I would say, with very religiously minded students. So there are fits, and sometimes they choose a good fit, and sometimes, but you know, the same thing happens with college students. Like regular college students, not all of them. Like, I went to high school and now I'm in college. So not everyone adjusts well. Any other questions? I'm afraid I offended some people. If I offended you, I'm very sorry.